Good day everyone, Nigon here from Nigon's Electronic Creations, along with Master Footman, and we're going to be going over the DualPhase feature of Igniter 2. This is the next video of our Features of Igniter series. Now before I get into the saber, I'm going to actually go over how to configure the DualPhase in the config editor, taking the SD card out and modifying it. I'm going to sort of go over how you copy the cards there, do the edits, copy it back, and then we will be putting our config that we've modified into this saber to check out how it works. So without further ado, let's go into the config editor.
Before we go over DualPhase on the saber, let's see how to set it up using the config editor for Igniter. So here I have this demo folder. It's basically right now the default files, and this is what we're going to be making our edits to. So we're going to basically add 3 DualPhase. Well, we're going to do 4, but the first one is just going to be exactly the first file of the default files. I just want to show you what that looks like, how to set up the standard. In the second font, I'm going to add basically the way to do the DualPhase to just trigger a sound. It won't change the blade color, it'll just trigger a sound. And then the third thing we're going to do is set up the lock style DualPhase. That's like for kind of like the cutting open a door, where you twist the DualPhase, it stays doing that sound repeatedly, kind of like the blade lockup. And then the fourth one is going to be, I'm actually going to shut off DualPhase since it's a setting per font. So you can show you how, like, if there's a font you want to use, you know, for that's the font you use for dueling or when you're sparring with friends. You can turn off DualPhase so you don't accidentally trigger a color change. Alright, so here we are in the config editor. Let's open the first font and just take a look at it, because it's kind of this typical DualPhase setup. So we're going to open that, and you can see there's basically 2 things to look at. First, you look at blade color. So this is our blade. It is completely green, in fact. Yep. And then if you go over here to the DP tab, that's for DualPhase. You can see DualPhase is enabled, and it's on the classic mode. And you can see the blade color for DualPhase is going to be kind of this. It's mostly bluish. There's a little tiny red thrown in there, probably just to lighten it up. You know, this is not a perfect representation, but it's kind of some bluish color. So that is pretty much your classic DualPhase. Now if we go to disk, it's really interesting to see. So in the dual, in this one we have 2 sounds, dual A 1 and 2 and dual B 1 and 2. And you always, for DualPhase for the classic mode, you really always should do have 1 A and 1 B at least. And if you have more than one, you can have more than 1 A and still just have 1 B, but you need to have at least one of both when you're doing the classic mode. And it's totally fine if you just copy dual A01 and copy it to dual B. Normally, a lot of times I just copy my dual A 1 2 3 4 and just have them be B 1 2 3 4. That works. Okay, so now that's pretty much your classic DualPhase. So let's go to the second. Let's go ahead and save. I don't think I made changes, but let's go ahead and save. So let's go to the second font. And what we're going to do with this font is we're going to use DualPhase just to trigger us as like a sound trigger. So if we go over here, let me get to that folder real quick. So that's our demo. This is where I'm just going to dump my demo sounds. So we're going to use this sound it's kind of a push sound. So you can see that's just kind of a, kind of like someone's pushing, and that's what we're going to use. We're going to trigger that sound, but we're not going to change the blade. So first, what we want to do, let's go to our font 2 here. We'll go to the dual because we know that's what we're modifying. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to replace these files. So let's just completely delete them. Now once they've been deleted, we can copy this over here, and let's copy this twice because we need an A and a B. So just do copy here again. That's fine. Now just rename this to dual A01 and dual B01. Casing doesn't matter, but I like the A and B capital to read it better. Now that we have that, we can load our config editor here, and this will automatically change the files. Since we had only 1 A and B before, it didn't really notice a change, so everything is fine. But if we added multiple, we would actually see this update. So that's good. Now there's a couple other things to note about this when we want the color to be the same. One is that we actually have to match the blade color. So let's say this is the color we actually want, this blue. So 214, 180. So since we don't want it to change, we can just put it here. 214, 180. Now, the thing is, you got to be careful because over here on blade color, there's this blade shade, right? And if this is up to something really high, like 50, 60, the blade could still change colors on you. So if you're like, oh, I have the same blade color set, but it's changing colors, this is probably why. So just make sure 8 is okay. Like, that's such a small amount, that little variance will probably be kind of cool. But if you don't want it to really change, make sure this is low. And then, lastly to note is, you can't use 0 if you're going to just trigger a sound, because it won't. Since using 0 means, oh, I need to calculate sort of like based on the color change. But since there's no color change, it will just think, oh, I'm done instantly. And basically that means you'll have no dual phase. So just make sure to set this something like, it really doesn't matter. Something like between 100 to 300 is totally fine. Since you're not changing the blade anyways, there's no effect here. So just change it really small like that, totally fine. And that will totally work to trigger just the sound. Excuse me. And now let's go to font 3. So for font 3, we were going to add the lock style dual phase. So here we're in dual phase. For the lock, let's say it's kind of like a clashish thing. So let's kind of do some kind of whitish. I'm just going to kind of guesstimate, like this is kind of going to be some kind of whitish. That looks kind of funky, but let's assume it's right. And of course I can always use the color editor built into Igniter, as I showed in the previous features of Igniter video, to actually change the color on the fly if this isn't perfect. But for now we'll just set it this. It's going to be a pretty good approximation. So now we need to change the fonts. So let's go here to our font 3, into the dual, that's what we're changing. Again, we can delete these. Okay, so those are deleted. Now, let's copy, this is going to be our lock sound. And I have this in the default files already in one of the fonts, but let's just put it here. So this is the sound. It's kind of like a lockup without like the crackling, kind of more of a vacuum cleaner sound, which is interesting, but that's fine. Let's use this one. And since for the lock, there's only one motion, you really only need a dual A. You don't need to do a dual B. You can do a dual B, it doesn't wreck anything, but you don't need to, so I'm not going to bother. And that is it. So let's go back to the config editor. Now this time, because I deleted dual B, you'll see, it says like dual B is 0. And again, because we're going to now change this to the lock, that's going to be totally fine. So make sure it's still enabled. And this will do it. So now we will have the dual phase. It will like go into the lockup and hold there until we tap the aux button to turn it off. And finally, let's go to, this one is really simple, but let's just go into font 4 here. This is the one we're going to use for sparring, and we don't want to accidentally trigger a color shift. So for this, it's really simple. Just click this. It doesn't matter what's set here now. The instant I de-click this thing, it's completely off. So I can change these settings all day long, and it will do nothing at this point for this font. So that's it. So now dual phase is off just for this one font. That way, you can have a specific font for sparring. Now that we've done all our configurations, this is sort of a general thing, not related to dual phase, but just in general with card editing. Basically, I've done all my edits here locally on this is like on my local hard drive. So what I'm going to do now is go over here to my my SD card. I'm going to go format this guy like this. This will delete all the files, get it back to a clean state. Then you can select all these files. Control A selects everything, and then we just want to copy this over here like this. I actually do right click and drag, because in Windows it kind of, if you're on the same disk, if you just use the regular click and drag, it will move it, and if you're on different disks it copies it, and I like to just always explicitly say what I'm doing, so I always right click and copy. Now, I'm not going to wait for this to finish. I'm going to stop the video now, and let's go to the saber, assume this is finished, and then we will see how these work.
Now that the files have been transferred and loaded back onto the saber, we can check out how this thing works. So let's first turn on the saber and check out the first font. So the first font was just the classic DualPhase. It's exactly as in the config. So you can see it swings, everything is normal. And then we can, just do the DualPhase motion to switch to the color. And then switch back, and that'll use the Dual A and Dual B sounds. So let's do the second font. Now this, again, can do swings and everything. But in this one, we did the DualPhase motion just triggers a sound. It doesn't change the blade color. So you see, you get that force push sound from that. Now in this one, instead of using the classic DualPhase, we use the lock DualPhase. Whoops. And that'll give you you see it stays into the second color, repeats the sound over and over again until you tap the aux button. And that way you can use it for the idea is for kind of like cutting a door. You can do that until you've cut it, and then tap the aux to turn off the effect. Finally, on this font, what we've done is just completely turned off DualPhase. So we've got a purple blade, but here you can see DualPhase. DualPhase just does a swing in this font. And there you have it. That is the DualPhase feature for Igniter 2.